The quiet of our Amsterdam apartment was a language we had both mastered, a dialect of comfortable silence punctuated by the soft click of Tomas's keyboard, the sigh of the espresso machine, and the distant chime of the Westerkirk clock. Tomas was a lexicographer, a man who spent his days tracing the evolution of words, their roots, their subtle shifts in meaning over centuries. Our love, I believed, was a definitive entry in his personal dictionary. Lena, proper noun, stability, comfort, home. We spoke in a shorthand built over 8 years, a vocabulary of finished sentences and understood gestures. A raised eyebrow over the dinner table meant the wine is corked. A hand on the small of my back in a crowded room meant I'm here. Follow me. It was fluent, efficient, and as deep as a puddle in summer. I mistook the absence of misunderstanding for the presence of profound connection. My own work was a silent art. I restored antique books for the university library, my hands performing delicate surgery on vellum and leather, coaxing faded ink back to legibility. My world was one of glue pots, Japanese paper, and the musty sacred smell of aging knowledge. Tomas admired my precision, my patience. "You have the hands of a monk, Lieveling," he would say, kissing my fingertips. But he never asked about the stories I painstakingly preserved. His interest was in the structure, the binding, the provenance, the grammar of the thing, not its poetry. The fracture in my quiet world began with a book, or rather, the man who brought it to me. The library's head of conservation placed a ruined 18th century volume of Dutch poetry on my workbench. "A private client," she said, lowering her voice, "very valuable, very delicate. He's particular, wants to consult throughout." The client was Cale Van Dyke. He arrived the next day, and his entrance was a disturbance in the library's hushed atmosphere. He wasn't tall, but he carried a contained energy that seemed to vibrate the air around him. His hair was the color of storm ash, his eyes a startling pale green. He wore a charcoal suit that should have looked conventional, but was undone by scuffed leather boots in the absence of a tie. He smelled of cold air and something else, something petrichor and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. "The surgeon," he said, his voice a low, rough timbre that felt entirely out of place amid the whispers. He extended a hand, and I saw ink stains on his fingers, the kind that comes from a fountain pen, not a printer. "Kyle Van Dyke. This," he gestured to the ravaged book, its spine broken, pages loose, "is my guilty pleasure. A first edition of Jacobus Bellamy. Not his best work, but his most reckless. Full of errors. The printer was drunk, they say. I find the flaws comforting. No one had ever brought me a book because of its flaws. They brought them despite the flaws, wanting them erased. I was disarmed. Lena Visser, I'll do my best to fix the errors." "Oh, don't fix them all," he said, a slow smile touching his lips. "Just keep it from turning to dust. The errors are part of its history, its personality." That was the first word in a new lexicon. Personality. Tomas's world was about correctness, about the right word in the right place. Cale spoke of personality, of flaws, of history. It was a heresy that felt like a revelation. He began to visit the conservation lab regularly, always with a plausible question about paper grain or iron gall ink. But our conversations quickly slipped their professional moorings. He was a poet and a translator, though he called himself a smuggler of meanings. He worked primarily with Nordic languages, dragging their stark, complex words into the softer confines of Dutch. "Language is not a cage, Mevrouw Visser," he said one afternoon, watching me realign a page with a micro spatula. "It's a landscape, and every translation is an act of cartography. You're always choosing which path to take, which vista to highlight, knowing you're leaving other paths forever in shadow." Tomas mapped the definite history of words. Cale was obsessed with their ambiguous, living present. He asked me questions Thomas never had. What did the texture of centuries-old paper remind me of? Which word in any language felt most like loneliness? If a sigh had a color, what would it be? I found myself fumbling for answers, my own inner vocabulary suddenly inadequate. He was teaching me a new language of sensation and metaphor, and I was an eager, desperate student. The first betrayal was linguistic. I began to think in his terms. The steady, predictable comfort of my life with Thomas began to feel not like peace, but like a sentence devoid of adjectives, a paragraph with no subtext. I started noting down Cale's phrases in the margin of my conservation log. The silence between heartbeats, the geography of a glance. They were cryptic, beautiful runes in a language I was starting to decode. The second betrayal was temporal. He asked if I'd like to see something truly alive, a poetry slam in a former industrial warehouse in Nord. I told Thomas I was attending a late-night seminar on parchment preservation techniques. The lie was a cold, smooth pebble in my throat. The warehouse was a cathedral of noise and raw emotion. Young poets shouted and whispered their pain, their joy, their fury into microphones. The air thrummed with bass and collective breath. Kyle didn't perform, but he knew everyone. He moved through the crowd, a conductor of chaos, introducing me to painters, musicians, a woman who crafted sculptures from rusted metal. They spoke a language of process and failure, of art as a verb, not a noun. I felt overdressed, overquiet, and utterly alive. When a poet finished a particularly wrenching piece about lost love, I had tears in my eyes. Cale leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. See? That's it. That's the word made flesh, not preserved in a book, but bleeding on the floor. His proximity was an electric shock. We left as dawn tinged the canals gray-pink. He bought Stroop waffles from an all-night vendor, and we ate them leaning against a bridge, the syrup sticking to our fingers. You have a quiet soul, Lena, he said, but quiet is not the same as empty. I hear a riot in your silence. No one had ever listened to my silence before. Tomas simply shared it. In that moment, on that bridge, a door in me blew open, and a wild, unfamiliar wind rushed in. The physical affair began in his apartment, a book-choked loft in the Jordan with towering windows and a palpable absence of straight lines. It was the antithesis of our clean, minimalist home. Books were stacked on the floor, papers covered every surface. A half-finished translation of a Finnish epic was pinned to a wall, connected by a labyrinth of red string. It smelled of coffee, bergamot, and the faint, sweet decay of paper. His touch was a translation of its own. Where Tomas's lovemaking was a familiar, gentle conversation, Kyle's was a series of urgent, declarative statements. He read my body like a difficult text, parsing its hesitations, emphasizing its passions. He whispered words in languages I didn't understand. Swedish, Icelandic, Faroes against my skin, as if trying to find the exact foreign term for the curve of my hip, the sound I made when he kissed a particular spot on my neck. Afterwards, he would talk, weaving stories of the lonely fjords and the silent tundra, and I would feel not like a restorer of the past, but a citizen of a vast, aching present. I became a bilingual liar. I maintained two lexicons, the primary, domestic one, grocery lists, reminders to pay the utilities, discussions about visiting Thomas's parents in Leiden, the secret, illicit one, phrases scribbled on scraps of paper and hidden in my purse. Kamos, the polar night, he'd taught me, also the depression that follows. The address of his loft memorized like a sacred rune, the times of our meetings coded as paper delivery in my calendar. I became an expert in dialectal shift-changing my speech patterns, my posture, even my scent when I moved between worlds. I kept a change of clothes in my locker. At work, simple, dark things, Cale said, brought out the nocturne in my eyes, and would change back into my Tomas clothes, soft linens, muted blues, before heading home. The guilt was a constant, low-grade mistranslation. Every kind act from Tomas now felt like a sentence in a language I was forgetting. When he brought me tea exactly as I liked it, the gesture, once intimate, now felt like a rote phrase from a phrase book. When he talked about our future, about buying a small house with a garden where he could write his magnum opus on semantic drift, his words, once a shared dream, now felt like a life sentence in a country whose borders had grown stifling. I began to manufacture friction, picking fights over his fastidiousness, calling our home a beautifully curated tomb. I was trying to build a case for my betrayal, to retrospectively translate his stability into stagnation. One afternoon in the tangled sheets of Kale's bed, I broke down. A memory ambushed me. Thomas, years ago, patiently teaching me to ride a bicycle along the Vondel Park, his hands steady on the small of my back until I found my balance. I wept, great, shuddering sobs of guilt. I'm a monster. He's a good man. He's kind. Kyle held me, his chin resting on my head. You're not a monster. You're a woman who was speaking a language she didn't choose, and now you found your mother tongue. It's a violent, beautiful homecoming. You can't unlearn the words, Lena. He reframed my deceit as a linguistic awakening. I clung to that narrative. It was the only syntax that made my agony seem noble instead of sordid. The double life was a relentless exercise in code switching. I bought a cheap pay-as-you-go phone, a burner, he called it, with a writer's relish for the dramatic term, and kept it sealed in a Ziploc bag inside a hollowed-out Dutch dictionary on my restoration shelf. I became paranoid about time, about carrying a stray scent, a different energy, back into the apartment on the Prinsengracht. My sleep, once deep and dreamless, became fractured with dreams of trying to scream in a language that produced no sound, or of watching beautiful, intricate script dissolve under my touch. Thomas, the master linguist, began to detect the foreign syntax in my behavior. Not the words, but the grammar of my being was off. The cadence of my days was irregular. My attention, once focused, was now diffuse, flickering. You seem elsewhere lately, Lena, he said one evening, looking up from a dense text on Proto-Indo-European root words. He removed his reading glasses, a sign he was giving me his full analytical attention. Is it the Van Dyke project? He seems to take up a great deal of your mental space. The observation was so precise it stole my breath. He's demanding, particular about his book. Particular, Tomas repeated, tasting the word. Yes, I've read his translations. He has a flamboyant disregard for lexical accuracy. He prioritizes feeling over meaning. He said it as if describing a moral failing. Be careful, Schott. Not all texts are worth the restoration. It was a warning couched in his professional jargon. A chill went through me. He was on to the contamination. The crisis was precipitated by a blizzard. A freak March snowstorm paralyzed the city. Thomas was stranded in Utrecht after a lecture. The trains canceled. He called, his voice crackling with static. I'll have to stay the night. The roads are impossible. Are you all right? Can you manage? I'm fine, as I said, my heart already hammering a frantic, treacherous rhythm. Don't worry, stay safe. The moment I hung up, I texted Cale on the burner phone. Snowed in. Alone. His reply was instantaneous. I'm coming. He arrived on foot, a dark figure battling through the whirling white, bringing a bottle of Genever in the heat of his body from the storm. Having him in our apartment, in our sanctuary, was the ultimate act of translational violence. We drank from our water glasses. We made love in our marital bed. The storm screamed outside, a perfect white noise for our transgression. It felt like the conquering of one country by another, the imposition of a new, brutal, thrilling language over the old. In the exhausted, snow-muffled silence afterwards, I made a catastrophic error. Lulled by the false safety of the storm in the Genever, I fell into a deep post-coital sleep. I forgot to strip the bed. I forgot to air the room. I forgot the time. I woke to the sound of a key in the lock. Dawn was a gray smear through the windows. The storm had ceased. Panic, pure and liquid, flooded my veins. Cal was already awake, his eyes wide with the same terror. We moved in a silent, frantic pantomime. He pulled on his clothes, I threw the duvet over the rumpled sheets. We opened a window, letting in a blast of Arctic air. He slipped out the back service entrance just as the front door opened. Tomas stood in the foyer, covered in melting snow, looking exhausted and relieved. The main roads are just passable. I hired a 4x4. I was worried. He stopped. His nostrils flared. He was a man who lived by words, but his senses were acute. He smelled the cold air, yes, but under it, the scent of a stranger's sweat, of Genever on 2 glasses in the sink, of the particular spicy sandalwood of Cale's skin, now woven into the fabric of our home. His eyes swept the room, missing nothing. The hastily smoothed bed, the single faint boot print of meltwater by the back door that I hadn't had time to wipe, the two glasses. He walked to the bedroom, saw the open window, the snow drifting onto the floor. He looked at me, still in my rumpled sleep shirt, my hair wild, my face flushed with guilt and fear. The silence that followed was the most profound of our life together. It was the silence of a language dying. "Who?" he asked, his voice not loud but hollow, scraped clean of all its familiar warmth. "Was your translator." The metaphor was his, devastating and perfect. He understood the crime not as a simple act of lust, but as an act of profound linguistic betrayal. I had allowed another man to redefine me, to rewrite the text of our life. There was no point in lying. The evidence was atmospheric, grammatical. I confessed. Standing there in the middle of the room we had built together, I gave him the unedited, ugly translation. Kyle, the poetry, the loft, the affair, the storm. I held back nothing, as if the sheer volume of my confession could somehow fill the chasm I had opened. As I spoke, I watched the man I loved disintegrate. His face, usually a map of thoughtful calm, crumpled through disbelief into a pain so acute it seemed to alter the light in the room. I hadn't just broken a vow. I had proven that his life's work, the belief in precise, knowable meaning, was a fairy tale when applied to the human heart. I had introduced a howling ambiguity into the core of his world. When my voice finally gave out, he walked to the bookshelf, to a framed photograph of us in Bruges, standing on a bridge. He took it down, studied it as if it were a document in a dead language, and placed it face down on the shelf. "I am a lexicographer," he said, still facing the shelves. "My vocation is clarity, definition. I trace the lineage of words so we are not adrift in misunderstanding." He turned, and his eyes were dry but shattered. "You, Lena, you have become a homonym, a word that sounds the same but means something entirely different. The woman I loved and the woman who stands before me share a name, a history, but they are not the same entity. I cannot build a life on a false cognate." He shook his head, a slow, final movement. "Our language is broken. There is no repair." He left that morning. His packing was an exercise in semantic precision. He took his research, his father's fountain pen, a few necessary clothes, and the face-down photograph from Bruges. He left the apartment, the furniture, every carefully chosen object of our shared life. "I don't want any of it," he said at the door, a single suitcase in his hand. "It's all part of the lost lexicon." The aftermath was a protracted, painful untranslation. Tomas communicated only through a crisp, efficient lawyer. The divorce was a clinical dissection of shared assets. He was impeccably, coldly fair. My father, a retired professor of classics, was devastated. "You didn't just break his heart, Lena," he said, his voice thick with shame. "You vandalized a library of trust. He thought you were a sacred text. You proved yourself a cheap forgery." Weeks later, I went to Cale's loft. I needed the author of my new language, the man for whom I had become a blank page. He was surrounded by boxes, books half-packed. He'd been awarded a prestigious fellowship in Reykjavik for 2 years. "Lena." "Hey." He looked up, his expression a mix of sympathy and distraction. "I heard. Shit. I'm sorry. That's rough. I thought we—" The sentence died in my throat, incomplete, lacking a verb. He came over, took my hands. His were warm, the hands that had rewritten me. What we had was a powerful poem, a sonnet in a storm. But poems end, Lena. They have to. That's what gives them their power. I'm a translator. I move on to the next text. You need to find your own voice now. Not his, not mine. Yours. He saw our affair as a brilliant, transient piece of literature. I had been a compelling source text, now fully translated and filed away. The riot he'd heard in my silence had been, for him, just interesting meter. I quit my job at the library. I could no longer bear the smell of old paper, the weight of preserving things. I sold the apartment on the Prinsengracht. I moved to Rotterdam, to a featureless, modern box in a building with no history. I took a job as a copy editor for a corporate training firm, my work now consisting of sterilizing language, removing ambiguity, ensuring every sentence meant one thing and one thing only. Now I live in a silent country. I speak only the functional language of grocery shopping and bus schedules. The quiet here is not the comfortable silence of shared understanding, but the void after the echo has faded. Sometimes I catch myself trying to remember a word in the language Thomas and I shared, the specific name for the soft, blue light that fills the apartment just before dusk, and I find it has vanished, replaced by a hollow space. I have become a woman without a native tongue, adrift between the lost vocabulary of a love I destroyed and the beautiful, empty poetry of a passion that was never meant to last. I am the ex-wife of the lexicographer, forever translating the untranslatable ache of my own regret, a sentence with no subject, a verb with no tense, a story forever stuck on the ellipsis of what might have been